We know that China is big and its market is highly profitable. But it is unsurprising that New Zealand exporters have tapped heavily into this market since New Zealand signed that China Free Trade Agreement back in 2018. China is now comfortably our largest export market, accounting for the largest share of our exports in all but a few sectors. Nathan Penny joins us now, Westpac's senior Agri Economist. This is all coming out of the Economic Bulletin of late, Nathan. What is that main message that you're trying to send there around how China has actually gone and restricted access to some lucrative markets because this is a strategic direction for China? And why should New Zealand be worried?
Yeah, hi Sarah. I mean, it's a really good question. It's probably the question I get asked the most when I talk to farmers in the regions. You know, are we too heavily reliant on China? So that's sort of the sort of my attempt in the last little while to answer that question for farmers. And it is a question of how much are we sending, what share are we sending of a particular export to China, but also how much they rely on us. So it's sort of a two-way thing. And there are some sectors where China is reliant on us to a degree, and those sectors we think are less vulnerable to a change in tune from China, whereas there are other sectors which are quite vulnerable should they decide to do things differently with us, like they have recently with Australia and Australia's coal exports to China.
I'm looking here at a bit of a graph that you've created around this exposure risk based on the export sector. Tourism, seafood, kiwi fruit, very high risk that China is exposed to New Zealand, yet wine right down there because obviously as that middle class is developing. How are our sectors individually trying to insulate that risk for them? And what is China going to do to be able to ensure that it's not at risk as well?
Yeah. A couple of questions in there, isn't there, Sarah? I guess the first thing is to note something like wine is actually just not exposed because we don't sell much wine to China. They're not big wine drinkers, so it doesn't really matter. Whereas, we do get a lot of tourists from China. And just to understand why is that sector at risk? Well, simply because Chinese tourists can go to any number of destinations. And they don't need to come to New Zealand. They could go to Thailand, they could go to Italy, they could go anywhere just about and not really worry about coming here instead. So if the Chinese government were to change its tune, like I said, it could basically prevent all Chinese tourists from coming here. And it's a similar thing with something like seafood and gold kiwi fruit. There's such a small, we're such a small player in those markets. So for kiwi fruit, it's in the broader fruit market. We're so small. Apples, but in particular bananas and pineapples are much, much bigger. So China again could just easily switch out of kiwi fruit into those other markets, and that would be one way if they wanted to. They could hurt us if they decided that was in their strategic interests.
And we're talking about this as well in regards to dairy. In this week's Farmers Weekly, the dairy forecast is skewed, and there is a great array that Nigel Sterling's put together of commentators on this. But you're saying that last year New Zealand accounted for over half of China's dairy imports, and that the Chinese dairy farmers are struggling to compete with us.
That's right. I mean, the key thing there, so we've mentioned tourism and seafood and kiwi fruit as being having high exposure risk, whereas dairy is different. It's because China is quite reliant on New Zealand for its dairy imports. As you said, about half of the imports come from New Zealand. And while they do produce their own dairy, they are not competitive. Their costs of production are well north of ours. Somewhere. There's lots of anecdotes out there, but it's at least $10 a kilo to produce milk in China. So really, if they can, they'd probably prefer to get it from here, and that's why, in a way, the proof is in the pudding. They've got companies like Yili and the owners of Synlait have set up shop here because they can access cheaper milk and more reliable milk as well. Let's not forget that Chinese milk at times has been not safe to consume. So not just the amount, but also the reliability of our supply coming from New Zealand, and also the competitiveness of the supply coming from New Zealand. So, taking all those factors into account, China will still tend to rely on New Zealand dairy, and therefore our risk into that Chinese market is lower for dairy.
It's not just dairy from your economic report. China's also extremely reliant on New Zealand for logs as well.
That's right, yeah. And so, China is a massive market for forestry, and mainly we send logs there. We see that as slightly higher risk than dairy, and the main reason there is there are a few substitutes for China to choose from. So they can go to Europe, Russia, and North America to a degree. And so while we are a big, we do account for a lot of China's imports, there are some choices for China. So if they were to choose to strategically put some barriers in place for our log exports, that could hurt us, but it also would hurt them at the same time. So hence medium risk, we've classified forestry as.
Oh, thank you so much. Nathan Penny's joining us there from Westpac as the Agri Economist, and this is following the latest economic bulletin entitled New Zealand's Exports to China, Where is New Zealand Most Exposed? It's a really great read.
This is Sarah's Country.